the man known to history as Suleiman the Magnificent or Suleiman I was born in the port of Trebizond on the Black Sea, otherwise known as modern-day Trabzon, in Turkey, on the 6th of November 1494. His father was Prince Selim I, a scion of the House of Osman and the son of Sultan Bayezid II, who had ruled the empire of the Ottoman Turks from 1481 to 1512. In 1487, he was appointed as the governor of the province of Trebizond, going on to forge a reputation as a skilled military commander in his campaigns against the encroachments of neighbouring Safavid Iran. Later on, he would become the Sultan for a short, successful but extremely violent period lasting from 1512 to 1520, after which Suleiman took his place. His mother was Hafsa Hatun, a princess of the Crimean Tartars who could trace her lineage all the way back to Genghis Khan, as she was directly related to the Mongolian warlord's eldest son, Jurki. He had at least 9 sisters and 5 brothers, with the majority of his male siblings executed by Selim once he had become Sultan. In total, Suleiman sired 10 children, with 3 of them dying of illness in quick succession at the start of his reign in 1520. His first significant partner was Gulbahar Hatun, a wife of Albanian or Montenegrin descent who, in 1517, bore him a single son, Mustafa, before she was replaced by the bewitching Hurrem Sultan, better known as Roxolana, the Sultan's greatest love and the mother of 5 sons, Mehmed, Abdullah, Selim, Bayezid, and Jihangir, as well as a single daughter, Mijima Sultan. In personality, Suleiman was a fiery and determined leader who wholeheartedly believed that he was Allah's earthly lieutenant, tasked with spreading the creed of Islam by all means necessary, but while he was a pious devotee, he was by no means a fanatic. Unlike his more dogmatic predecessors, he hewed to a more lenient and practical interpretation of the Quran, which taught greater religious tolerance for non-Muslims. As a result, Suleiman was renowned for the kindness and compassion he often displayed to his non-Muslim enemies. However, this was also accompanied by intermittent acts of brutality when deemed necessary. As an individual who had empathy for the struggles of normal people, Suleiman made it his life's work to deliver justice by passing many laws that protected the rights of his subjects and which were continually added to his law code, the Canon-i Osmani. One of the most important measures in this regard protected commoners from the abuses of provincial governors and officials by allowing them to freely complain about their conduct without fear of reprisal. Under Suleiman, justice was so swift that even European observers would marvel at the astounding equity of a system that didn't seem to discriminate on the basis of religion nor on class. Lastly, away from the day-to-day grind of running an empire, Suleiman was extremely bookish, being known to devour tomes on philosophy and faith and to engage in discussions with the most esteemed scholars as their intellectual equal. In appearance, the young Suleiman was tall and thin and had a light moustache, a short beard, a prominent chin, and a distinctively hooked aquiline nose and pale complexion that betrayed his European heritage. By the time he was an old man, his beard had turned grey, his neck had slunk down to his shoulders, his cheeks had sallowed, and his profile was plump rather than slender, yet, according to chroniclers, he still gave off an unmistakable air of dignity and majesty. Founded in the 13th century, over the course of 2 centuries the Ottoman Empire evolved from a squabbling confederation of warring tribes into a feared superpower whose territories extended from the Balkans to the far eastern reaches of Anatolia, the large peninsula that makes up most of the current territory of Turkey. In 1453, Ottoman forces solidified their status as masters of the Near East by seizing Constantinople, which had for centuries been the capital of the Byzantine Empire, a successor to the original Roman Empire. Thus, when Suleiman was born in Trebizond, which had been the last Byzantine territory in Asia, the Ottoman Empire was considered one of Europe's strongest kingdoms. Since his father Selim was never expected to become Sultan, very little is known about Suleiman's childhood, but an attempt can be made to sketch out what it would have been like. He would have spent his earliest years at the imperial palace in the provincial capital of Komneni, a picturesque coastal town situated among rolling hills and deep ravines that was protected by imposing city walls. Until the age of 7, he would be looked after exclusively by his mother and her maidservants before his education was turned over to his hard-nosed father. In the classroom, he would have learned reading, writing, arithmetic, music, and languages. On the training field, he would have engaged in physical activities such as archery to nurture his combat prowess, and, in accordance with an Ottoman tradition that saw merit in physical labour, like his father, he would be taught the ways of the goldsmith. At aged 11, he would have moved out of the women's quarters and been given a residence, servants, and a royal stipend, and then, 4 years later, his grandfather, Sultan Bayezid II, would give him his first princely responsibilities. In 1509 he was appointed as governor of Karahisar, but Suleiman's uncle, Ahmed, complained that it was far too close to Amasya, where he himself was governor. He was still not satisfied when this was changed to Bolu, which was located on the road from Amasya to Constantinople, because he feared that on the day the Sultan died, his nephew could easily cut off his route to the capital to claim the throne for himself. His anxieties were not out of the ordinary, as the Ottomans had a well-established history of violent succession that made every member of the House of Osman suspicious of each other. Having taken Ahmed's concerns into account, Suleiman was instead sent to the fringes of the empire in Crimea to oversee Kaffa, near to his mother's Crimean homeland. After 3 years there, he was recalled following the outbreak of a succession dispute between Prince Selim and his brothers Korkut and Ahmed, the latter of whom had been named as heir to the throne by the aging Bayezid II, who had abdicated and then died in suspicious circumstances. Emerging victorious from the scuffle was Selim, who, upon his accession in 1512, murdered all of his brother's children, had both Ahmed and Korkut strangled, and then had the rest of his male relatives, including his sons, executed apart from Suleiman. The new Sultan grew naturally wary of his chosen heir, and so transferred him far away to Manisa on the Aegean coast where, apart from brief stints in Edirne, near Bulgaria, and another in Istanbul, he stayed until the death of his father in 1520. During his brief but impressive 8-year reign, Selim conquered both Egypt and Syria, eradicated the influence of Safavid Iran from the Anatolian heartlands, and achieved the submission of the Sharif of Mecca to make the Ottoman Empire the undisputed masters of the entire Islamic world. Now in control of a realm that stretched from the Balkans to the Nile River, he secured lucrative trade routes to Asia, the Mediterranean, North Africa, and the Red Sea, and imposed custom duties and taxes that doubled Ottoman revenue. Meanwhile, Suleiman proved his mettle by crushing banditry and restoring order to a region that had devolved into lawlessness. Yet, instead of being impressed by his son's achievements, the Sultan grew even more paranoid. According to one story, Selim tried to get rid of him by sending a poisoned shirt, but his scheme was foiled by his son's concerned mother, who made sure that a servant put it on instead. In 1520, while travelling from Istanbul to Edirne, Selim suddenly died, and after being informed, an anxious Suleiman made his way to the capital fearful that it was just a trick by his father to lure him to his demise. Yet, upon his arrival, the young princeling encountered no opposition, mainly because there were no challengers, and he had the support of the Janissaries, the elite infantry units sworn to protect the Sultan, who had so often acted as kingmakers in the past, and so, as a result, the handover of power was a surprisingly smooth affair. The reign of Suleiman the Magnificent began on the 30th of September 1520, when a convoy of 3 war galleys transported him to the banks of the river Bosphorus at Üsküdar, Constantinople. The next day at dawn, chief dignitaries of the realm paid homage, and then he went to Edirne to join the funeral procession, following it on foot and ordering that a mosque be built there in his father's honour. His first act as Sultan was one that would guarantee his own self-preservation during his early tenure, with the influential Janissaries and leading statesmen that had supported him being bestowed with generous gifts and pay rises. By rewarding them in this way, he was distinguishing himself from his bloodthirsty father, who had become notorious for his eagerness to execute people on all sides of the political spectrum. He further signalled that his reign would be one of peace and tolerance by releasing thousands of imprisoned nobles and traders and putting to death many of his father's hated minions. This outpouring of clemency and justice was extremely refreshing for those who had lived in fear under the thumb of Selim, being described by one chronicler as like the heavenly dew on a sunny plain. On the other hand, Suleiman could not please everyone, and before long, the first challenge to his imperium came in the form of a rebellion in Egypt, masterminded by the power-hungry governor Cambirdi al-Hazali. However, the uprising was crushed when the governor of Egypt, Hayra Bey, loyally revealed his strategy. With the embers of discontent doused before they could spread, the Sultan next drew up ambitious plans to carve up the Kingdom of Hungary, which had, since the collapse of the Byzantine Empire in the mid-15th century, been their main European rival. Following the assassination of a Turkish envoy that had been sent to the Hungarian court to demand annual tribute, preparations began for a major expansion into Europe, starting with the capture of Belgrade in Serbia, which would be used as a launch pad into Hungary and Austria. Bedecked in a robe of embroidered silk and a turban studded with precious stones and diamonds, in February 1521 he set off from Constantinople to much fanfare for his debut campaign. Employing the signature Ottoman tactic of heavy bombardment, Belgrade was cannoned for 3 weeks straight until the last of the defending Hungarians and Serbs fell honourably in battle. Suleiman's victory was extremely worrying for the other powers on the continent, who saw in the fall of Belgrade the capitulation of a critical bulwark of Christianity in Eastern Europe to a disciplined and formidable army of Islamic heretics. Hysteria was only heightened the next year when the island of Rhodes became the next Christian bastion to succumb to the Ottoman onslaught following a 4-month siege of attrition that ended with the Grand Master of the Knights of St. John kissing the Sultan's hand and offering him 4 golden vases in tribute. Since they had surrendered graciously, Suleiman treated his foes very kindly, sparing the majority of the island's population and exempting them from royal taxes for 5 years. With Belgrade and now Rhodes annexed, Christian observers glumly predicted that Christian Cyprus and the rest of the islands of the Dodecanese would be the next to fall foul of the Turkish menace. A few months after returning to Constantinople in triumph, to much controversy, Suleiman appointed his lifelong friend as his new Grand Vizier, a powerful position that put the holder in charge of the government, the administration, and the majority of the army, except the Janissaries. Ibrahim was a good-looking and intelligent Greek slave who had been elevated to the highest office of the land because of his unlikely friendship with the Sultan, who was so besotted with him that they even went on unaccompanied walks and boat trips together. The elevation of a man with such humble origins, who was also referred to by chroniclers as the favourite, to the most coveted posting, ruffled the feathers of Ahmed Pasha, a blue-blooded aristocrat and governor of Egypt, who realized that while Ibrahim was alive, the Grand Viziership would always be out of reach. Taking matters into his own hands, in Cairo he slaughtered the Janissaries loyal to the Sultan and secured the backing of Arab and Mamluk chiefs, but just as the rebellion was set to begin, his allies abandoned him, and he was assassinated. This was by no means an isolated incident, for what followed was a raft of copycat uprisings that illustrated how Egypt was spiraling out of control. To neutralize the threat, Ibrahim was sent to Cairo in 1524, and with an iron fist he crushed dissent, executed conspirators, and skillfully reorganized the administration into a system of checks and balances that limited the power of the governor to such an extent that Egypt remained largely docile until the beginning of the 19th century. At the same time as Egypt was being subdued, another revolt broke out in Istanbul, this time perpetrated by the Janissaries, who had decided to ransack the Jewish quarter and the palaces of the viziers in the belief that Suleiman, who was away on an extended hunting trip at Idiane, was not planning any military campaigns in the near future. Immediately rushing back to Istanbul, he reimposed his authority by rounding up and killing with his own hands the 3 ringleaders, as well as purging the rank and file, punitive measures that were so effective that for the rest of his reign the Janissaries never dared to step majorly out of line again. With his domestic affairs back in order, he next sent a threatening letter to Shah Tahmasp of the Persian Empire that clearly demonstrated the confidence bordering on arrogance that exuded from the Sultan following his flawless run of military victories in Europe. With gusto, he warned the Shah that, "If you keep to the path of error, soon the click of sabres and lances and the boom of cannons will tell you that the hour of your defeat has arrived. And then, even if you bury yourself in the earth like an ant, or take flight like a bird, I will keep you in my sights and, with the grace of God, seize on you and rid the world of your poisonous presence." With the Persians sufficiently forewarned, throughout the winter of 1525 and 1526, Suleiman engrossed himself in preparations for the second phase of his European campaign. As the head of the Islamic world who counted the holy site of Mecca as one of his territorial possessions, it was his divine duty to expand Islam at every available opportunity, and a weakened and divided Hungary had been identified as a particularly ripe target. Marching off from Istanbul in April 1526, the Ottomans marauded their way up the Danube until they reached the Drava River, where a bridge built to transport troops across was immediately destroyed on the orders of the Sultan, so that his men would not even entertain the thought of retreat. Striking onto the Mohacs plain, and being met by the armies of King Louis II of Hungary, the battle commenced, with an impactful Hungarian cavalry charge that caused Ottoman soldiers to fall back. With the Turkish ranks now open, 22 of the bravest Hungarian knights made a beeline for Suleiman as arrows and lances ineffectually bounced off the Sultan's thick armour. Like fish to bait, the Christian horsemen were lured towards the royal entourage to enable the Turks to close in on them on both sides, and then they were completely massacred when Ottoman cannons were let loose. By the next day, 30,000 Hungarians, including their king, had perished, and outside the Sultan's tent, 2,000 heads were piled up to form a grisly pyramid. As his army readied to leave, Suleiman announced that no harm was to be done to the local inhabitants or their properties, but the command was largely ignored, despite his desperate efforts to stop the ensuing bloodbath. After being graciously received by his adoring subjects in Constantinople, John Zapolia was appointed the new vassal king of Hungary, which remained an Ottoman puppet state for more than 150 years afterwards. With the Hungarian issue settled, Suleiman next put Europe's leading Christian kingdom in his sights. Upon the death of his father Maximilian I in 1519, the Habsburg monarch Charles V had won an imperial election to proclaim himself king of the Holy Roman Empire, meaning that from that point on he exercised overlordship over Spain, Sicily, Sardinia, the Low Countries, as well as Austria. Despite this, the Sultan rather insultingly referred to Charles as the King of Spain, since he did not recognize his claims to the other realms. Alarmed by rumblings which suggested the Christians were planning a holy crusade in May 1529, Suleiman set out from Constantinople to make a preemptive strike against Islam's nemesis at Vienna. Following an arduous 2-month march to Belgrade, in which many men were swept away by burst riverbanks, the Sultan returned to the battleground of the Mohacs plain to receive an oath of fealty from the defeated Hungarians and their king, John Zapolya. After this, they went further northwards until they reached Buda, or modern-day Budapest, which was occupied by the brother of Charles V, Ferdinand of Habsburg. It was on the 5th day of the ensuing siege, after one of the city gates was carried off by the Ottomans, that the defenders were overwhelmed and butchered. With the last obstacle torn down, in autumn 1529, with 120,000 men and 28,000 camels, Suleiman proceeded directly to the crown jewel of Charles's empire, Vienna. Following a 3-day opening bombardment, the Ottoman army broke through several breaches in the wall, only to be repulsed again and again by brave Habsburg soldiers. With the Turks unable to overcome stubborn resistance, Suleiman made the decision to withdraw from Vienna, framing it as a compassionate act of retreat that spared the lives of his men and his enemy to avoid admitting the embarrassing reality that he had simply been outmaneuvered. Another major reason why the Ottomans failed on this occasion was also the difficult logistics of transporting provisions, ammunition, weapons, artillery, men and horses over the enormous distance that separated Constantinople and Vienna, a Herculean task that was made harder by a complete lack of infrastructure and roads in between, as well as by snowy weather conditions. Nevertheless, despite the Vienna setback, when Suleiman came home, he was still as popular as he had ever been, and the Ottoman Empire was still at the very height of its glory, as was illustrated by the extravagant party to celebrate the circumcision of his sons that occurred a little after his return. The morning of the 27th of June 1530 began when the Sultan rode to the Hippodrome, the social and sporting centre of Constantinople, to take a seat on a throne surrounded by his leading dignitaries, which was sheltered by a canopy of dazzling gold. To signal the hierarchy, his viziers donned smaller turbans topped with a gold band, while Suleiman wore a high turban adorned with 2 heron's feathers that was much bigger than the rest. After being showered with an opulent array of gifts ranging from Venetian velvet to Chinese porcelain to virile Arabic mares, the festivities commenced with mock battles, performances from acrobats, clowns and jugglers, and public speaking competitions. Then there was the circumcision ceremony in which guests, who were compelled by custom to kiss Suleiman's hand, engaged with him as he lay languidly on a low couch covered in exquisite carpets. As they made their way up for the brief audience, accompanying chamberlains held their arms down to make it impossible for any would-be murderers to pounce. Then, to wrap up proceedings, the crowd moved to the Plain of Sweet Waters for a number of thrilling horse races. Back in the comfort and safety of his palace, there was one courtesan who was particularly delighted to see him again after his long absence. According to tradition, Roxolana had been abducted by Tartars in Poland, sold into slavery, and purchased by Grand Vizier Ibrahim, who had then gifted her to his master. By all accounts, a playful, flirtatious, and intelligent woman who quickly won the admiration of Suleiman throughout the 1520s, she experienced a meteoric rise through the royal harem. So enamoured was she by Roxolana, who was known to sing and play on guitar enchanting old Slavic songs, that the Sultan began to desire only her, to the chagrin of his chief wife, Gulbahar, the tensions between the two women eventually boiling over into a physical altercation in which Roxolana's hair was pulled and her face scratched. Unable to see his lover in such a sorry state, when Suleiman learned of the fight, he made it clear that from that day forward he didn't want anything to do with Gulbahar, who was sent out of sight to her husband's old stomping ground in the province of Manisa when her son, Mustafa, took over the governorship there. While Roxolana definitely would have used her good looks and charm to agitate for a better position in the royal household, the love she had for Suleiman was sincere, and many love letters between the two survive to this day. Then, in around 1533, in an event that was underreported by Ottoman chroniclers, who disapproved of Roxolana's lowly pedigree, the pair got married in an exuberant wedding ceremony. Bestowed with the title Hurrem Sultan, for the rest of her husband's reign, the couple would share an exclusive monogamous relationship that was extremely unusual in Muslim society, and until the end of his life, she exercised much influence over him behind the scenes, but not total influence, for Suleiman remained resolute in his decision-making. This was an attribute he displayed in October 1530, when a cortege of emissaries representing Charles V's brother Ferdinand, whose claim to the Hungarian throne had been snubbed in favour of John Zapolya, travelled to the Ottoman court to ask that he be given back Hungary. After unsuccessfully trying to bribe Grand Vizier Ibrahim to accede to their request, they were sent to Suleiman, who was waiting in his palace. As they entered the court, the first things the envoys saw were 2 elephants, 6 lions, and 2 leopards in chains, in an exotic display meant to both impress and intimidate, before they were told by the Sultan in no uncertain terms that Hungary was off limits. In fact, the meeting only galvanized the Ottomans to finish what they had started in Hungary, large tracts of which were claimed by Ferdinand at the time as his rightful property. Leading a vast column of 100,000 troops and 300 cannons, on the 25th of April 1532, the Sultan left Constantinople and made his way to Belgrade, where he was provided with an additional 100,000 reinforcements. In desperation, Ferdinand's delegates offered 25,000 ducats and then 100,000 ducats in exchange for the Kingdom of Hungary, but to no avail. After razing much of southern Hungary, the Sultan successfully besieged the citadel of Gurns, after which it was thought that he would proceed directly to Vienna, where Charles V was holed up. However, to the great surprise of all, the Turkish army turned east towards Styria instead, ravaging it throughout September before heading back to Constantinople by way of Belgrade on the 18th of November 1532. Despite not having much to show from his European sojourn, during which he had failed to engage Charles V in battle, Suleiman was nevertheless given a hero's welcome. The celebrations were soon marred by the news that several poorly defended island forts in Greece had been seized by Charles V's trusted admiral, Andrea Doria. The attacks illustrated clearly that the Habsburgs wanted to make the Mediterranean a second front, and so, in response, the Sultan charged the admiral of his fleet, Haya ad-Din, better known as the legendary pirate Barbarossa, with re-establishing the Ottoman presence over the oceans. On the other hand, having just returned from a disappointing campaign in Europe, and with Persia now next on his hit list, for the time being Suleiman was content with an uneasy peace, as he made preparations to conquer Baghdad and restore his authority in eastern Anatolia. With his empire experiencing growing internal strife between Catholics and Protestants, and with his coffers running low, Charles V also desired a cessation in hostilities at this point, leading to a peace treaty both were happy to adhere to for a time. With his European frontiers freshly secured, he could now devote his resources to the campaign he would wage against the bothersome Shah of Iran, Tahmasp, the current kingpin of the Shiite Safavid dynasty that had risen to prominence from the beginning of the 16th century. For over 30 years, Suleiman's Sunni forebears had competed with them for domination over the frontier regions that separated both realms, with his father, Selim I, having come closest to extinguishing them following a decisive victory at the 1514 Battle of Chaldiran, in which the founder of the Safavids, Shah Ismail, had miraculously escaped after being seriously wounded. Suleiman's objective was to finish off what his father had started with an aggressive invasion designed not only to weaken the Iranians, but to stamp out their influence over the Shiites within the Ottoman Empire in Anatolia and Thrace. Setting off in autumn 1533, Grand Vizier Ibrahim laid out the groundwork for his benefactor by securing Azerbaijan, forcing the surrender of several Iranian castles near Lake Van, and then wintering in Aleppo before walking unopposed into the capital of the Safavid Empire, Tabriz, in July 1534, just after Shah Tahmasp had fled. 2 months later, Suleiman joined the Grand Vizier in Tabriz, and the next phase of the proceedings, the conquest of Baghdad, was commenced when an army of 200,000 men made the long and difficult hike through the Zagros Mountains to spill out onto the Mesopotamian plains. But when they reached the Holy City, they found that it had been completely abandoned by the Shah of Iran, who was attempting to starve the invaders from afar by torching crops that lay in their path. Entering Baghdad in early December 1534, Suleiman's religious credentials were boosted, for he could now link himself to the Abbasid Caliphate, one of Islam's most long-lasting and celebrated dynasties, who were said to have been descendants of an uncle of the Prophet Muhammad. On the other hand, this monumental triumph was soon tarnished by an episode of court intrigue back in Constantinople that ended with the puzzling death of one of Suleiman's closest confidants. On the morning of the 15th of March 1536, With his clothes torn and with bloodstains spattered on the wall, the lifeless body of Grand Vizier Ibrahim was discovered in his bedroom, which was next to the Sultan's, and even more mysteriously, the corpse was quickly transferred to a monastery and buried in an unmarked grave. The hit job had occurred inside the royal palace, indicating that Suleiman had had something to do with it, yet there exists no definitive answer as to why he had his most loyal associate killed. Since the Grand Vizier owed everything he had to the Sultan who had raised him from the bottom of the rung to the very top of the ladder, it is unlikely that Ibrahim betrayed his master, and there is no evidence to support this either. Another explanation posits that Ibrahim fell victim to the whispers of Roxolana, who, detesting the Grand Vizier's strong influence over Suleiman, wanted to ensure she held full sway over him. On balance, however, it is most likely that Ibrahim's ballooning arrogance had the most to do with his demise, for as his power and wealth had accumulated, the Grand Vizier had started to step out of line more and more. The haughty tone he had adopted while negotiating with Ferdinand's emissaries, just before the conquest of Baghdad, for example, illustrated his increasingly reckless sense of self-importance. During those discussions, he is purported to have said, "I can make a sultan of a stable boy. I can give territories to whoever I want without my master making any comment. And when he orders me to do something I don't like, nothing is carried out." In addition to overreaching his station, Ibrahim, originally a Greek Christian slave, was despised by the general population because he openly showed contempt for Muslim tradition on multiple occasions, a bad look for the leader of the Islamic world. After the Battle of Mohács, for instance, he had exhibited 3 looted antique sculptures in the Hippodrome, prompting widespread accusations of idolatry. By March 1534, it is probable that the cavalier behavior and criticisms of the Grand Vizier had become too pressing to ignore, impelling Suleiman to dispose of his favourite and to replace him with the more submissive Ayas Pasha. Following the violent reshuffle, Suleiman next picked up where he had left off in the Mediterranean Sea, where his chief admiral Barbarossa, who had served the Ottomans since the reign of Selim, had achieved a number of victories, most notably at Tunis, whilst his liege lord had been gallivanting in the east to the great concern of Charles, who was becoming increasingly worried that a large North African Muslim state, unified under the Ottoman banner, would endanger Spain. To reverse the tide, in July 1535, the Holy Roman Emperor personally orchestrated the recapture of the under-defended Tunis, prompting a furious Suleiman to completely overhaul his navy throughout 1536. With his conflict with the Holy Roman Emperor continuing to heat up, it was around this time that the King of France, Francis I, began making a more serious bid to form an alliance with the Ottomans. Since the 1520s, France had been so heavily weakened by English incursions to the north and those of the Spanish to the south that it had had no other choice but to make overtures to the enemy of their enemies. However, Francis's dalliance with the Turks was highly controversial for the sole reason that he was essentially considering an association with a power that other Christian nations, and even dignitaries within his own court, viewed as a satanic plague threatened to tear the seams of Europe apart. As a result, the King of France, ironically known as the most Christian king, was constantly forced to walk a tightrope between publicly condemning the Turks for being the scourge of Christianity, whilst privately wooing Suleiman for his friendship. Nevertheless, in 1535, a formal alliance was signed, leading to the planning of a joint conquest of Italy, in which the Ottomans would capture Brindisi, Naples, and Rome, while the French would march on Genoa and Milan in lockstep. On the other hand, Francis, anxious at the prospect of being the accomplice of the Antichrist, failed to keep his end of the bargain when he changed his mind at the last moment and waged war in Picardy and Flanders instead. As soon as Suleiman, who had travelled all the way to Valona in Albania to liaise with the French fleet, learned his erstwhile allies were a no-show, the Italian offensive was cancelled, and a new target, the Venetian island of Corfu, was selected. Since 1502, after having been defeated by the Sultan's grandfather, Bayezid, the Republic of Venice had maintained good relations with the Turks, mainly because it was not in the interest of the small Italian city-state to wage expensive wars that threatened their prosperous maritime trade empire. However, the relationship began to sour when the Venetians, whose economic and political influence in the Med was being threatened by France, not only refused to join the Turkish-French coalition, but made clear their support for Charles. The final straw came when a rogue Venetian convoy attacked an Ottoman vessel carrying a diplomatic mission without the permission of the government. The Venetian head of state, the Doge, did not have time to bring the perpetrators to justice before 50,000 Turks and 50 cannons swooped on Corfu, whose formidable defences could not be breached. Exasperated at the sluggish progress on Corfu, and left in the lurch by Francis's impromptu decision to abandon Italy, a frustrated Suleiman withdrew back to Constantinople, where he tasked Barbarossa with putting an end to Venetian preeminence once and for all. Duly obliging with 70 war galleys, the grizzled corsair secured the surrender of 25 Venetian-controlled islands in the Aegean Sea with very little resistance, and enchained thousands of their Christian residents. The seizures fanned wider fears that the Ottomans were preparing to strike further north on the European mainland, compelling Venice, Charles V, and the Pope to enter into a temporary alliance called the Holy League. In September 1538, the Christian fleet rendezvoused at the Greek port of Preveza with the intention of confronting the much smaller naval forces of Barbarossa in what should have been a devastating and decisive counterblow. However, discussions on how to approach the battle led to a delay which allowed Barbarossa to escape from their clutches. In particular, hesitation from Charles V, who probably wanted to keep his fleet intact to defend shipping lanes in the western Mediterranean instead of deploying them to protect his Venetian rivals, meant that a golden opportunity to banish Islam had slipped through their fingers. From then on, calling in to port at one of their many North African bases, especially Algiers, the Sultan's corsairs were kings of the Mediterranean, from east to west. At the end of August 1541, Charles, worried that the ascendant Ottomans were now planning a great expedition to the west, set out to attack Algiers in an attempt to rebalance the scales that seemed cursed from the get-go. At first, their landing was delayed by a storm, giving their enemy more time to prepare, and then, as the siege was underway, a large segment of the fleet was smashed to pieces by another violent tempest, prompting the abandonment of the whole enterprise. In the meantime, the death of John Zápolia in July 1540, whose only son, John Sigismund, was an infant of the time, emboldened Ferdinand of Habsburg to make another attempt to reclaim the Ottoman vassal kingdom of Hungary, starting with the besiegement of Buda. Reasoning that the vulnerable baby John Sigismund would remain a minor for too long, Suleiman made the decision to permanently annex Hungary into the imperial fold and to make the young sovereign the vassal king of Transylvania instead. With Ferdinand's armies having largely been driven away, he entered Buda unopposed in September 1541 to confirm the new administrative arrangement. Over the next 2 years, Ferdinand tirelessly endeavoured to offer the Sultan money and gifts, and when that failed to bear any fruit, the Habsburg lord organised a new crusade to deliver Hungary from the infidel. In response, Suleiman mounted the 8th campaign of his sultanate from April to September 1543, culminating in the conquest of Székesfehérvár, the traditional coronation and burial place of Hungarian monarchs, and in 1547 a peace treaty was eventually brokered that allowed Ferdinand to keep a hold of his Hungarian territories so long as he paid 30,000 ducats annually for the privilege. At the same time as Hungary was being assimilated by the sword, Suleiman and the French king opened additional fronts against the Holy Roman Empire, hoping to better the disappointing results of their Italian misunderstanding of 1535. This time, the Turkish and French fleets would jointly attack through the Mediterranean as French troops marched on the western land border of the Holy Roman Empire at Flanders, while Ottoman warriors took the fight to Ferdinand in Central Europe. From the start of April 1543, just as the Sultan was leaving for Hungary, 110 Ottoman galleys led by Barbarossa despoiled the Italian coasts of Calabria, Sardinia, Corsica, and Naples, and mercilessly sacked Nice and Toulon. However, although the operations had gone relatively smoothly, smouldering tensions between French and Turkish naval officers hamstrung any further progress. While Barbarossa bitterly complained that the inferior French fleet was not fit for purpose, being particularly irked that they had run out of gunpowder, the French were tired of trying to collaborate with an ally that was so different, leading to the premature disbandment of the expedition. Upon hearing the news, Suleiman flew into a towering rage, lambasting Francis I for squandering his chance to take full advantage of the world-beating Ottoman navy. On the other hand, despite a few hiccups, the scheme had worked well for the King of France, for the Mediterranean sally had caught the Holy Roman Emperor off guard and compelled him to sign the Peace of Crespi in 1544. This somewhat normalized relations between the two powerhouses, with Charles relinquishing his claims to Burgundy and Flanders, and Francis renouncing his designs on Artois and Savoy. Suleiman was incensed that the French had patched up their differences with his nemesis, but his anger abated little when he was assured by Francis, ever sensitive to how he was perceived by his Christian peers, that he only wished to mislead the public into thinking he was against the Ottomans. After a while, the explanation was begrudgingly accepted by the Sultan, who, on June 13th, 1547, was more than happy to agree a 5-year peace truce with the Europeans as he made preparations for his forthcoming war with the Persians. Since the campaigns of 1535 and 1536, Suleiman had had much difficulty stabilizing his eastern borders because the allegiances of his opportunistic feudal lords constantly shuttlecocked between the Ottomans and the Persians. However, in 1548, a tantalizing opportunity presented itself with the emergence of a dynastic tussle between Shah Tahmasp and his brother Elkasmirsad, who had taken refuge at the Ottoman court. In the spring of that year, as Mirsad stirred up unrest in Azerbaijan, the Sultan proceeded to Erzurum in eastern Turkey before laying siege to Van and Aleppo. By the time Suleiman had finished 20 months later, he had acquired 31 new towns, demolished 14 fortresses, and constructed 28 others. However, he had not been able to achieve his main objective of meeting and destroying Shah Tahmasp, who, like his father, Shah Ismail, usually ran away when faced with a combat situation. The Sultan's failure galvanized him to organize another Persian campaign in the summer of 1552, yet it had hardly got off the ground when civil war between his own sons, Mustafa and Bayezid, broke out. Mustafa was the son of Gulbahar, the out-of-favour first wife, while Bayezid was the son of Roxolana, the woman who had supplanted Gulbahar as the queen of Suleiman's heart. Over the years, Mustafa had earned for himself an excellent reputation by proving himself countless times on the battlefield, and thus he was earmarked as the natural heir to the throne. By 1552, at the grand old age of 58, Suleiman's popularity was waning with a certain segment of Ottoman society who thought he was too old to lead, who resented his promotion of Islamized Christians to top offices, and who would happily see the more sprightly Mustafa take over. Yet his elevation was a mortal danger for Roxolana, who knew that he would immediately consolidate his rule by murdering her and strangling all of her sons, and so, with the assistance of her dependable ally and son-in-law, the Grand Vizier Rustem Pasha, she charted his downfall. Strife began when Suleiman, wintering in southern Turkey in anticipation for an advance across the Anatolian plateau, was informed by Rustem Pasha that Mustafa had established friendly relations with the Shah of Iran and was planning to take the throne. With a mixture of alarm and seething wrath, he cancelled the Persian campaign and went back to Constantinople, where for the whole winter Roxolana and her cronies convinced him that Mustafa's intentions were genuine. The next summer, while on campaign, he summoned Mustafa to his camp at Eregli, promising that he would be given the chance to clear his name. The son answered the call, entering his father's tent, which had been obscured and soundproofed by curtains. Suleiman's henchmen immediately pounced on him and killed him, and then Mustafa's corpse was placed outside to warn the others of the consequences of overstepping their mark. After this, he continued his killing spree by executing Mustafa's son Murat at the instigation of Roxolana, who had manipulated him into thinking that his grandson was also scheming against him so that her stepson's bloodline could be completely eradicated. The string of deaths made him extremely unpopular with the common folk, who bewailed the loss of the most brilliant lights of the House of Osman as the Sultan continued his campaign in the east. After wintering in Aleppo, Iranian settlements in Armenia were ruthlessly levelled, and in May 1555, another peace entente provisionally put hostilities on hold. Suleiman tried his best to maintain cordial relations with the Shah, as well as with the Khans of Uzbekistan on the other side of Iran, who could keep an aggressive Persia in check, because, back at home, trouble was brewing yet again. The first domestic disturbance came when a pretender to the throne in Iregli, northwest Anatolia, who claimed to be the deceased and much-loved Mustafa, and who promised his followers that riches would be seized and redistributed to the poor, managed to assemble a force of thousands that swept through the regions of Thrace, Macedonia, and Dobruja. This provincial rebellion ended when this Ottoman Robin Hood was hanged by Bayezid, yet it had starkly revealed the simmering discontent of the peasant population. Because mobilizing for and waging war was an expensive business, Suleiman had elected to increase the taxation of the common people, who were beginning to suffer from financial insecurity, also caused by growing inflation induced by an influx of cheap silver from Europe. With the population already in a high state of aggravation, the disillusioned riffraff would support Bayezid when, following the death of Roxolana in March 1558, he went straight for the throat of his brother Selim and his Janissary allies. The complex chain of events that led to the civil conflict was set in motion by a devious official by the name of Lala Mustafa, who, after being appointed Grand Master of Selim's court, proposed to his new lord a scheme in which he would personally play the role of double agent. The plan involved Mustafa being transferred to the court of Bayezid, where, under the pretext of offering help to get rid of Selim, he would purposefully misguide him so that he would make mistakes that would lead to his downfall. Lala, who coveted the position of Grand Vizier, played puppet master by telling Selim of his brother's eager desire to get rid of him, as well as making it seem as if Bayezid had sent him a skirt and a woman's bonnet to create maximum insult. Then Selim told his father about his brother's designs, prompting the Sultan to send Lala Mustafa with a letter of reproach to Bayezid. However, en route to his court, Lala purposefully killed his messengers and had himself arrested to make it seem as if Bayezid had assassinated him, the result being that the Ottoman prince was sent to the distant province of Amasya in disgrace. However, Bayezid refused to obey and instead assembled an army of 20,000 that was routed, causing him to flee to Amasya, where he sent a letter to the Sultan requesting to be pardoned that never reached its intended recipient, for it was intercepted by the crafty Lala Mustafa. A fugitive from justice, in 1559, Bayezid and his sons defected to Persia, where they were granted asylum by Shah Tahmasp, eager to have an Ottoman prince in his locker, who welcomed them with spectacular festivities. Behind the scenes, however, the Shah was secretly negotiating with Suleiman and had put forward a proposal that would see Bayezid forcibly returned on the condition that Persia be given back Baghdad. Unwilling to see the Iranian potentate re-establish a foothold on his eastern flank, he declined, but after several more months of wrangling, it was agreed that Bayezid would be handed back for the princely sum of 300,000 gold pieces. All the Sultan had to do now was wait for the best moment to carry out the exchange, yet he was by no means happy about it, with observers reporting that the Sultan's face now seemed permanently etched with sadness. In September 1561, the opportunity to catch Bayezid finally came when, taking part in celebrations at the Shah's side, Tahmasp was approached by one of his chamberlains, Mahmud Pasha, who openly warned him with the words, "Be careful of a son who has betrayed his father and could take away your life." The Shah immediately left, but Bayezid had heard everything, and so, in fury, he had Mahmud Pasha beheaded. After this, two of Pasha's co-connivers declared that the Ottoman rebel had incited them to assassinate the Shah, resulting in his arrest, the summary execution of his entire entourage, and the transferal of Bayezid and his 4 sons into the custody of Prince Selim, who had them all strangled. Now, in the twilight of his life, Suleiman devoted what wells of energy remained to the consolidation and maintenance of Ottoman territories in the Mediterranean and Europe. This would compel him to flex his martial might for one last time in Central Europe, which had sat on the back burner until the death of Ferdinand of Habsburg in July 1564 prompted his successor, Maximilian, to reopen the Hungarian question by harrying the Ottoman frontier. The incursions brought about an ironclad response from the ailing 72-year-old, who, despite not having led an expedition for more than 10 years, took to the field for his final military campaign at the head of a contingent of 300,000. Unknown to him, when he left Constantinople on the 1st of May 1566 to exact revenge, he would never see his glorious capital ever again. Too weak to ride a horse and riddled with gout, for the first leg of the journey he was driven by carriage from the Bosphorus to Belgrade, opting to stay in the comfort of his coach even when receiving his viziers. En route to the battle zone, the Sultan also suffered on bumpy roads and dirt tracks that assailed his weakened frame with painful jolts, and then, after arriving in Transylvania, he travelled to the town of Szeged with 90,000 men and 300 cannons in August and ordered it to be besieged from his sickbed. The town quickly fell, and with customary Ottoman brutality, its commander, Count Nicholas Zrinyi, was made headless by the mouth of a cannon. Yet the Sultan would never know that the citadel had been taken, and nor would he learn of the gruesome fate of its lord, for on the night of the 5th of September to the 6th of September 1566, Suleiman the Magnificent died with only his doctors and Grand Vizier by his side, and the throne was passed over to his sole surviving descendant, Selim. Born just as the Ottoman Empire was approaching full bloom, Suleiman the Magnificent spent the first part of his life in Trebizond, where he was educated and raised as a minor Turkish noble. Upon reaching adolescence, he was appointed as the governor of Kaffa on the borderlands of the empire, but was recalled back after 3 years by his father, who vanquished his sibling rivals to claim the empire for his own. Surviving the ensuing purge of male relatives, he became heir to the throne and was posted far away from Constantinople to Manisa, where he stayed for the majority of Selim's bloody tenure. In 1520, he was crowned Sultan, opening his reign with a series of compassionate acts that set him apart from his paranoid father, while at the same time he crushed a rebellion against him in Egypt. Then Suleiman hit the ground running with a series of spectacular European military conquests against Christian powers, which saw Belgrade and Rhodes incorporated into the Ottoman sphere. After pacifying the unruly Egypt once more with the assistance of his best friend and Grand Vizier Ibrahim, the Sultan struck deeper into Hungary, making it a subject kingdom and nearly seizing Vienna from his Christian nemesis, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Following his marriage to his soulmate Roxolana, Suleiman next took up arms against the Persian Empire, during which he easily swiped Baghdad from the battle-shy Shah Tahmasp, and then, shortly after that, he had the arrogant Grand Vizier Ibrahim executed for having delusions of grandeur. Bringing the fight directly to Charles V, next on the agenda was to conquer his Italian possessions. However, the Sultan's unreliable ally, Francis I of France, pulled out at the last minute, and 25 Venetian islands were taken instead. Entrusting his chief admiral, Barbarossa, with continuing the Ottoman crusade in the Mediterranean Sea, Suleiman went back to Hungary and permanently annexed it after it was attacked by Charles V's brother, Ferdinand. Setting out east again, he inflicted another catalogue of devastating humiliations on Tahmasp, but having failed to defeat the Shah in battle, he resumed the offensive after a short pause, only to be stopped in his tracks when a dynastic showdown erupted between his sons, Mustafa and Bayezid. Compelled to protect his own position, as well as the integrity of the realm, he had the popular Mustafa killed in his tent, leading to a public outcry. Spurred by the murder, economic crisis, and a general feeling that the Sultan was now too old to rule, the dissatisfied populace rallied behind Bayezid when he declared war on his brother Selim. Fleeing to Persia after being defeated, Bayezid and his sons were handed back and strangled after Suleiman paid an astronomical sum of money to Shah Tahmasp for their return. Heartbroken, sickly, and infirm, Suleiman the Magnificent died whilst on campaign to Hungary, having transformed the Ottoman Empire into a near-invincible superpower. What do you think of Suleiman the Magnificent? Do you think he is deserving of his title, the Magnificent? Or do you think he owed his success mainly to the weaknesses of his opponents? Please, let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.